Okay, in this third video we're going to be looking at the difference between the estimated and the actual budget outcomes. And the difference between what they estimate in May and what actually happens in the following November can be quite a large difference. So first of all, the actual budget outcome is released in November, and the government will often miscalculate what they estimate growth to be. So they might estimate growth of say 1% and end up being 3%, and they get a bigger surplus or a smaller deficit than they thought. They can also estimate, say, growth of 5%, and then they only get growth of 1%, and that would have a big impact on the actual budget outcome. It also means budgetary policy is less effective because the government, for example, may have employed discretionary measures to boost the economy, but then they find out that they didn't need to because the economy was growing faster than what they thought. So, if growth is slower than what we expected, it's going to have a massive impact on our deficit for two main reasons. Firstly, the government's automatically going to collect less tax and pay more welfare. And secondly, if we are growing slower than what we thought, the government's first job or role will be trying to boost our growth. So if they anticipate growth of 5% and we only get 1%, first of all, we're not going to get as much tax because they're not going to have as much employment, and we're going to be paying more welfare. But then secondly, the government's also going to be employing discretionary measures to try and increase the pace of economic activity. And that's going to push us even further into deficit. So what I mean by that is, if growth is slower than expected, one, we're going to collect less income tax because there'll be more unemployment, and people may have lower incomes because there's less demand for their products. There's going to be less company tax because companies aren't making as much money. And because people don't have as much money, they're not spending as much, and that will lead to less GST. And all of this stuff is the automatic stabilizers, which will happen and push us further into deficit. But they're not the only thing that's going to push us into deficit. So this is the first thing that will push us into deficit. The second reason we will go into further deficit is the government is likely to impact discretionary policies that are expansionary if we're growing slower than what we thought. So for example, if we're growing at 1%, they might be spending more money on infrastructure to get us out of that trough. Or they might be giving people cash handouts like they did back in 2008, just to try and get people to spend to generate employment. They might also be spending money to try and get people back into jobs, so like youth strategies to get people jobs or things like that, or spending on training or education. There may also be more discretionary measures to help reduce the social problems with high unemployment, so for crime prevention, for helping people with mental health issues. And all of this stuff is going to cause the deficit to blow out. So for example, 2011-2012 we had the floods. They predicted the underlying deficit would be 22.6 billion. Then the floods hit and the deficit ended up being 44.6 billion. And the reason it was so much higher was, one, the government had to spend money to fix the damage from the floods, and that cost around $7.6 billion. But also, because of the flood, businesses weren't able to generate revenue and people lost their jobs, and therefore they didn't collect as much income tax and company tax. So the automatic effect was another 14 billion, and together these pushed the deficit out by another 21 or 22 billion dollars. Again, another example in 2014-2015, we estimated a deficit of nearly 30 billion. But then what happened is economic conditions deteriorated. In terms of trade fell, so companies didn't make as much money on the minerals, and that led to an even bigger deficit than anticipated. So there was a fall in company tax and income tax. Because companies weren't making as much money, and income tax because miners their incomes reduced, and that blew the budget out to over $40 billion, mainly because of automatic stabilizers. So here's a question from last year's exam. Outline the likely impact on budgetary outlays, so expenditure, and budgetary receipts if the rate of unemployment in Australia continues to rise. So some things you might want to talk about. First of all, budgetary outlays will tend to rise because of decreased unemployment through the implementation of automatic stabilizers and increased unemployment, which will mean there's more people qualifying for social welfare or on New Start allowance or need welfare for the government. That will increase their expenditure. Point one. Point two, the government's going to collect less tax because more people are unemployed. Point three is that because people are unemployed, they're not spending as much, and that will lead to a decline in indirect taxes, so less GST, perhaps less excise taxes if people aren't smoking or drinking or consuming as much petrol. All of that happens automatically. Point four, companies won't make as much money because there won't be as much demand for goods and services, so company tax might fall. There you've got four key automatic things that would happen if we grow slower than what we think. But in addition to that, the government may employ discretionary measures to boost our economy as well. So if we're growing slower and unemployment's too high, they might be spending money on infrastructure or spending money on trying to get people back into work or education to try and reduce structural unemployment. They may also be targeting spending to try and boost aggregate demand. So, for example, they might be giving people cash handouts or anything to try and boost the level of economic activity. Other discretionary policies may include policies to reduce social disharmony, which is generally higher when there's more unemployment or increased inequity in society, helping people with mental health issues, family disharmony, and perhaps helping them with the affordability of housing because they have lower incomes and less purchasing power. So to answer this question in its entirety, or to answer this question in its entirety, you want to talk about the automatic impacts on outlays and receipts and the impact on outlays through discretionary measures for full marks. So here's another example. Explain why an actual budget outcome will rarely be the same as an estimated outcome. Use an example referring to automatic and discretionary stabilisers. The budget outcome is announced in May, the result is in November, and they can often miscalculate. If the government anticipates growth at 3%, but we only get 1%, unemployment will rise, the government will collect less income tax and pay more in welfare. Always mention those two things first, and that's the result of automatic stabilisers. They may also employ discretionary measures, so tax cuts, infrastructure projects to boost the economy, which is going to push us even further into deficit in order to avoid a recession. In this way, the actual budget outcome becomes very different to the estimate. Next video, budgetary policy stance.